He had that dream again last night. He somehow felt that he was near the water and heard two people laughing at him. It was such a vague, stupid dream that he didn't even think to mention it to anyone, not even his wife. They were well on their way to their goal when Derek's navigator flashed a warning. He looked at him, frowned, and said, "Paul, you don't have anything better to do you?" Paul, his traveling companion, said with an amused tone in his voice, "No, well, actually, no. What happened?" He replied, "There was a serious accident on the motorway, 2 junctions ahead of us. I'll get my GPS to plot an alternative route. If we turn off at the next junction, we can avoid the accident and get back on track. We'll be late, but at least we'll get there." After half a minute, he sighed. "Oh, those famous last words. The alternative route is also blocked. It looks like we won't be able to get to the northern office before 6 in the evening in the current situation. Instead of looking for another route, I'll take the next junction and return to the southern one. Direction, back to London." He pointed to his phone in the holder on the dashboard. "Paul, buddy, could you do me a favor? Call the office where we're meeting and tell them what happened, and tell them my apologies." Paul dialed the number and made the call. When he ended the call, he turned to Derek. "Do you want me to call the main office and tell them what happened?" "Please," answered his companion. But when Paul tried to dial the number, nothing happened. He frowned. "Sorry, I think I just broke your phone," he said with an apologetic look. "Oh no! Again. It's not you. I keep telling our IT people that there's something wrong with that damn phone. I think there's a bad connection somewhere. I'll go to IT right after lunch. I have a few things I could do before then. What will you do with the unexpected free time at the office? If we go back to 1, I might just stop by my wife's office and invite her to lunch. She's been working on a number of special projects lately. I'm worried she's been overworked these past 12 months. She always seems so tired." Derek was silent for a few seconds, waiting until he had circled the caravan before answering. "Sorry about that, but caravans always make me nervous on the road. Yes, your wife is the personal assistant to Gary Briggs, the CEO of the company. I understand that you and Beth know Gary and his wife Sally socially. Doesn't that cause problems?" Paul answered easily. "Well, you'd think it would cause problems, but it hasn't affected us. So far, no difference. We usually keep work and pleasure separate." Derek sped up, passing the garishly painted taxi before speaking again. "Are you going to call your wife and tell her you're on your way back?" "I'd really like to," Paul said, smiling. "But guess who left his cell phone in his briefcase in the trunk?" "Ah, never mind. I'll see David Banning, my supervisor, after lunch. He can reschedule the meeting with the Northerners." He glanced briefly at Paul, quickly returning his gaze to the motorway that led them back to London. "And you? Who is your boss now?" "Still Gary. I still report to him." "Ah, I was wondering if maybe you had been demoted. After all your big projects over the last few years, it must seem like a step back when you have to sit through sales presentations and regional office meetings like the one I had planned for today." "It's not a demotion, although I understand why it might look that way. It's a little strange, I admit. While I'm not entirely sure about it, it's just what I assumed. It seems that Gary is worried about some people he didn't think were effective enough, but he didn't know what to do because he wasn't sure whether their failures were self-inflicted or if they were somehow let down or deprived in some way by the company's training program. And because he himself had been heavily involved in the development and implementing the training program, he wanted to make sure everyone got a fair chance before placing blame on anyone." Derek said, "Yeah, I understand. That probably makes sense. Still, it doesn't seem like the best use of your skills. Unless he has an idea to somehow get to the root of the problem and have you create a director-level program for her decisions?" Paul nodded, saying, "You may be right, although he didn't say anything like that." They then began discussing non-work-related matters, Aston Villa's or Chelsea's chances of winning the cup, or the grand national contenders, and other similar topics that men discuss on long, boring car rides. They arrived back at the North London suburban headquarters of their employer, Hyperology, just before 1 p.m. Derek parked his car and walked out onto a nearby shopping street as Paul, briefcase in hand, entered a huge complex consisting of several office buildings and a modest production site where prototypes of the company's products were being built for testing and to finalize designs before production. Production at the main plant near Cheadle-Hulme, near Manchester. Paul put his briefcase down in the office, noticing that his attractive secretary, Ronda, had already left for lunch. It's a pity, he thought. She could make a reservation for him and his wife, Beth, at one of the nearby restaurants. Anyway, there's a Wetherspoons on the main street. There was no need to make a reservation there, he consoled himself. Plus, lunch with Beth would be nice, even if it meant stopping by the local Aldi, grabbing some breads and cheeses and a couple of those cute little bottles of wine with screw caps, and eating lunch al fresco in the nearby park. It will still be magical as far as Paul is concerned. The offices of the senior executives of the Hyperology Corporation were on the ground floor. So it was a fairly short walk from Paul's office to the offices of his wife, Beth, and their boss, Gary. Gary and Beth had adjacent offices with a door between them. Paul walked into the outer office of Beth's assistant, Gil. When Gil saw Paul, she froze. He didn't notice the frightened expression on her face. "Good afternoon, Gil," he said cheerfully, opening the door to Beth's office. "Please don't come in, Paul," Gil stammered, but it was too late. When Paul opened the door, he himself froze when he saw Gary having sex with his wife Beth on her desk. Their heads both turned at the same moment as they realized they were not alone. Gil said in a quiet voice, "Beth, your husband is... She stopped, suddenly realizing that she was talking nonsense. Paul looked, but he did not look at the traitors. Rather, he looked through them and for them. They met his glassy gaze, horror written on their faces. Paul turned and staggered away. No one said anything as he walked past Gil, not acknowledging her existence. Ronda soon returned to her office and noticed that the door to Paul's office was open. She wondered who might have come into his office in her absence. Then she saw Paul sitting in his chair. It was pushed towards the corner wall, far from his large desk. He looked so bad that at first I thought he was having a heart attack, she later told a friend. "Mr. Augustine? Paul? Are you okay?" She walked up to him and noticed that he was staring into space and shaking so hard that his teeth were chattering. She touched his neck to find his pulse. He was weak and fast. His skin seemed damp and cold. She noticed that his breathing was fast and shallow, and his lips were blue. She had worked as a nurse for several years before deciding to move into the corporate world, and she maintained her first aid training, so she knew Paul was not actually suffering from a heart attack as she had first assumed. "Shock?" she thought to herself. Paul, are you okay?" she asked. There was concern in her voice. He slowly turned to her. He answered haltingly, "No, Ronda, I'm not okay. I just found out that my marriage is over. I found out in the worst way." The next few hours passed in a blur for Paul. Somehow, Ronda was able to get him to drink a cup of hot, sweet tea. How terribly British, he thought. But the tea, as they say in the old books, somehow made him feel physically better. But mentally, not good. He knew he had to talk to Beth, to her lover, and to his wife, Sally. God, this will be awkward. How do you tell Sally that he and she have been deceived? Ronda and someone else, a man, perhaps Phil from the accounts department, he couldn't be sure, were able to take him home. They asked if he wanted them to stay, but he politely refused. He wasn't sure they knew, and he didn't want to risk falling apart in front of them. He sat in his living room thinking about what to do next. He wanted to call his wife, but found that he couldn't gather his thoughts on what to say after what he had seen. 15 years of marriage, and everything was gone in an instant. He then got angry that Beth didn't even bother coming to his office to see how he was doing. She didn't even call him, let alone come home and check on him. He believed that this showed that she didn't really care. She and Gary were probably together laughing at him. This dream. Could they really laugh about it together already? Make fun of him? Did he see their thoughts? Penetrated into their dirty minds? Although he was not prone to drinking, he suddenly felt the urge to drink. He looked into the drinks cabinet and noticed, just behind him, a liter bottle of vodka that someone... He couldn't remember who had brought with them from their holiday in Eastern Europe. Neither he nor Beth particularly liked vodka, so it sat there for a couple of years. He took out the bottle and grabbed the glass at the same time. When he broke the paper seal on the neck of the bottle, he had another idea. A darker, more sinister idea. He remembered something he read in history class at school. These were the words of Sir Walter Raleigh as he felt the sharp blade of the axe that was to cut off his head. This is a harsh remedy, but a sure cure for all diseases. He left the bottle and glass on the coffee table in the living room and went to the kitchen. He opened the drawer they called the medicine drawer, where all the prescription and over-the-counter medications were kept. He rummaged through it until he found what he was looking for. By force of habit, he closed the drawer and returned to the living room. He looked at the bottle on the coffee table, then looked at the 2 packs, one in his left hand, the other in his right. Cures for all diseases, he said out loud. He filled the glass with vodka and opened both packs. Fine. They were full. They would suit his purpose. They will be a reliable remedy for all his illnesses. He developed a cruel feeling of revenge. He imagined what would happen. 2 lovers will sneak up to the house. They will then find his cold, dead body in the living room. Bastards! This will teach them. In his left hand were strong opioid painkillers that Beth had been given when she injured her back, and in his right hand were sleeping pills that she had also been prescribed. But she didn't use either of them. He took a painkiller, then a sip of vodka. Then he took one of the sleeping pills and another, larger sip of vodka. He took another painkiller, put it in his mouth, and reached for the vodka again. Meanwhile, 3 very unhappy people sat in the dining room of Gary and Sally Briggs's mansion at 12 Damson Alley. Sally spoke first. "Oh, you stupid, worthless fools. Of all the fucked up stupid things you could have done, you should have let him catch you making love together. Jesus Christ. What the hell were you thinking? As for you, Gary, you're the CEO of your own successful company, supposedly highly intelligent, and you allow our very dear friend Paul to see you and his wife in bed." Gary took a sip of his scotch before speaking. "Well, Sal, I know it sounds bad, but... Well, it's really bad, but we tried to be discreet, you know, but we somehow... They completely ruined everything. Damn it. If your idea of discreetness is making love to your mistress on her desk with the door unlocked, then you have no chance. Do you understand that this will now be discussed throughout the company?" "Oh, God. Really?" Beth asked. "Yes, it's true," Sally replied, her voice becoming a little harsher. "When we started this whole thing, didn't we agree that we didn't want or let Paul know anything that was going on? To protect him? We all knew that he would never accept the idea of you 2 as lovers, that we needed to keep him in the dark to make him happy. So what are you 2 doing? You expose yourself to him in the most cruel, terrible public way. You humiliated him publicly and you broke his damn heart, you idiots. Do you realize that he may never get over this? He may never forgive us? Have you talked to him?" They shook their heads, silent, like naughty children in front of the headmistress. "Oh, really?" There was rage in her voice now. "Beth, you should have at least made sure he was doing well, or at least asked him how he was feeling. Where is he now?" Beth spoke up. "He's home. Or at least I think he is. I asked my secretary, Jill, to check. Looks like Ronda, his secretary, and some guy from the accounts department helped get him home." "Well, at least that's something. Do you want to call him now?" Beth shook her head. "No, I really don't know what to tell him." Sally shot her an angry look. "How about, I'm sorry? How about this?" Beth said. "But apologizing for what? Apologizing for me helping you with Gary? No, I can't say I'm sorry for that. Apologizing for hurting him? Of course, yes, for that. But I'm too embarrassed to call him now." Gary took out his cell phone and made a call. He spoke into it. "Hi, Paul. This is Gary. Listen, buddy, what you saw? Even though what you saw must have shocked you, please, you have to believe me when I say that we never meant to hurt you like that. And what you saw might, well, if you let us, me, explain to you what it was about, I think it'll answer some of the questions you have. There must be. Please don't think that this has damaged your marriage in any way, because it hasn't. Not really, not if you don't want it to. Please come to our house tomorrow at 10 o'clock and we can all have a decent civil conversation about the situation. We really need to explain some things to you, and frankly, you deserve an explanation." The call went straight to Paul's cell phone answering machine. While Gary spoke, Paul was busy, almost mechanically following the routine he had established. Left hand, painkiller, sip of vodka, right hand, sleeping pills, sip of vodka, then repeat. The next morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, Paul rang the doorbell on the post at the entrance to the Briggs family home. Alarmed, Gary opened the door and let him inside. They walked from the hallway through the door on the right, which led into the living room. Two women were waiting for him, sitting next to him. This surprised Paul. He realized that if they could sit so close to each other without fighting, then maybe the message he had heard from Gary at about 8 a.m. was correct when he said that some things needed to be explained. Paul stood looking at them. Gary stood awkwardly next to his wife, looking a little like one of those awkwardly posed Victorian studio photographs. Paul told them, "You three look like one of those damn Victorian studio photographs. Everything is very static and formal, and all the corruption and malice is just bubbling inside." They did not know how to respond to his unexpected remark, so they remained silent. "Nobody wants to say anything?" Paul said. There was a sarcastic and almost cruel tone to his voice that scared them, but especially Beth. "Paul," Beth said, "that's not like you. Where is my husband, my sweet, kind, gentle, warm, loving husband?" "He's dead." "You killed him," Paul said cruelly. Beth covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Sally hugged her, comforting her. Sally looked at Paul carefully. There was something strange and different about him. He didn't shave and looked exhausted. He looked pale, deathly pale. She swallowed before speaking. "Paul, I know what you saw must have come as a terrible shock, but how are you? What did you do last night? Did you sleep at all? Did you eat anything?" Paul trembled before speaking. "No, I didn't eat. I couldn't. Sleep? Not very much, almost nothing. And as for what I did last night, I, to my shame, must admit that in a moment of despair, I tried to commit suicide by drinking a liter of vodka and swallowing 2 packs of tablets. Unfortunately, at the last moment, vodka let me down." They looked at him, shocked by his words. Gary was the first to come to his senses. "Oh, Christ! Oh, Paul, buddy, I'm so sorry. We knew what you saw would upset you, would hurt you, but to drive you to the point of attempting suicide. Oh, damn!" Beth looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "But what would we do if we found your dead body? What would we do?" "Would you all laugh at me again?" Paul asked, shrugging. They all looked puzzled by his remark. He suddenly felt very, very tired and sat down in a comfortable chair that was across the room from them. He looked at them. "Why? How long?" They looked at him. Sally was the first to speak. "Listen, Paul, I understand that having us all together here in front of you is all wrong. It probably adds to your feelings of betrayal and loss and makes you feel a lot worse. Can I come and sit next to you, please?" Paul shrugged his shoulders in agreement. Sally stood up and walked towards him. Paul, to his credit, made no mistake in sitting next to Beth. He remained where he was, silently watching. Sally sat down on the wide, soft right arm of the chair. She pressed herself against Paul, but he did not react. She placed her left hand on his right hand and said, "Paul, I'm so sorry about how things turned out, but if you'll let me explain how it all started and what happened, I hope we can all move on and that we can help you and Beth stay together as a couple." She squeezed his hand and said, "Do you remember early last year when I was rushed to a private clinic for a gynecological problem? Well, they had to do an operation, and as a result of the operation, which I think they botched, I became physically unable to ever have sex again. I knew Gary was a very passionate man. He told me it would be fine for him to do what he called 5-fingered samba, but I was afraid he would cheat, that he would start dating someone else. He might even leave me. He assured me he wouldn't. But despite his assurances, I was still worried. I mentioned the problem to Beth one morning over a cup of tea. I think you and Gary were playing golf. And she suddenly blurted out, "I can help if you want. I can be your replacement for Gary." At first I thought she was joking, but then she convinced me that she wasn't. We discussed how we could organize it. A couple of days later, we mentioned the idea to Paul. Of course, he was in favor. Quite early on, we decided that you'll never come to terms with the idea of borrowing money from your wife, even if it was for such a noble purpose. So, and it pains me to say this, to admit it, we decided to keep you in the dark. I'm really sorry about that. But we're sure we could arrange it so you'd never know, and it wouldn't hurt you at all. But now, well, you've suffered a lot. We can all see it. The discovery that you tried to commit suicide makes me feel very bad about what we did. Paul looked up and then looked down again. When did it start? Sally replied, It was 12 months ago. We decided that the first time would be at a barbecue that we had. If you remember, it was a wonderfully warm summer day. We were cooking and eating outside, relaxing by the pool and drinking. I'm a little embarrassed to say this now, we put something in your drinks to make you fall asleep. And as soon as you fell asleep, Gary and Beth got up. Beth came over to you, kissed your forehead, whispered that she loved you, and then they walked into the house together, holding hands. Paul looked even sicker. And then what happened? She shook herself before continuing. I stayed with you. I felt like it was my responsibility. At least I owed you that much. I held your hand, stroked your head, apologized to you for what we did with your wife. I think I even cried a little. Suddenly, I felt very guilty, because you were here, so vulnerable. You were our good, very good, dear friend, and we were betraying your trust. I felt it was my responsibility to keep an eye on you so that nothing bad happens. Paul shook his head. Maybe it would have been better if I had died then. After all, if I had died by your pool, I would never have known that Beth was cheating on me. Beth screamed, But I don't want you to die, and I'm not cheating on you, I'm just sleeping with Gary. Paul shook his head again. Treason, whether plural or singular, is still treason. Paul looked straight ahead. What happened that first time? Gary and Beth exchanged glances. We left you with Sally. Then we went into the house and made love in the guest room. I didn't think it was fair to use our marital bed, Gary said. Paul looked at them before speaking again. What happened when you left? We went back to the pool. Sally was sitting next to you, holding your hand, Paul whispered. Did you laugh at me when you saw me? No, Beth screamed. We didn't laugh. What makes you think we would? She sounded worried. That's not true, Beth. Sally's voice sounded tired. When you got back to the pool, you were both actually laughing at Paul. I scolded you, and you both felt guilty. You explained that you laughed mostly out of embarrassment, but also because you found it funny to see him lying there, dozing, under the late afternoon sun. She looked at Paul thoughtfully. Why did you ask that? Did you have a reason? He told them about a recurring dream, about him being near water and people laughing at him. They looked at him, they were all stunned and somewhat ashamed of themselves. He pushed Sally's hand away from him. I can't believe you risked my life. Damn it, neither of you are medical professionals. You could have easily killed me. Haven't you thought about that? They shook their heads. Obviously, they weren't thinking about it. Sally took his hand again. I'm sorry, Paul. I really am. We didn't think your life would be in danger. Gary chimed in. Listen, we've also done everything we can to protect your marriage. Well, we've talked about everything, and we realize that if you don't get exclusive time with Beth, it could hurt your marriage. So we made sure we never have sex in your house, only here, at work, or in a hotel room. And we decided that Beth should belong exclusively to you every weekend. Beth then chimed in, and that's why I started the idea of only having sex with you on the weekends, because it didn't feel right to me that my husband was following my lover into bed with me, having sex with me on the same day. Because, as hard as this may be for you to accept, it was never a matter of cuckolding, this relationship between us, mine, and Gary. It was something separate from our married life. There was never any intention of humiliating you in any way, either way. You have to believe me. You have to believe us. Damn it, Paul said loudly. You just don't understand. How condescending and contemptuous you three are. You allowed me to have complete and exclusive rights to my wife on the weekends, after you had her like a rusty gate for the whole damn week. Damn! Really? Don't you understand, Gary, that having my wife 5 days a week versus my 2 makes the whole thing so damn unbalanced and completely unfair to me, even if I agreed to it knowing that? And you're saying it wasn't your intention to humiliate me? Well, with you two having sex on Beth's desk, with your poor secretary knowing what you're doing, seeing how broken I was from discovering your connection, hearing the nasty things you said about me. How humiliating do you think that is? Gary shook his head. Sorry, it shouldn't have happened. And what I said about you being Beth's pathetic husband, I didn't mean it. It was stupid of me. Paul looked at him, then looked at the other two, landing on his wife. And the icing on the cake, most people at work knew about it before I did. He saw their surprised faces. Oh yes, Beth. Your secretary knew. And I was wondering why people in production started humming the Laurel and Hardy theme. Beth looked puzzled. Sorry, honey. I don't understand. Why did they do that? Gary blushed and Sally sighed. Sally said, Oh, God, it's terrible. How could they know? Paul responded, Because you weren't as careful and discreet as you should have been, right? And for your information, Beth, they mocked and despised me, making me a cuckold without letting me know why. And even those who didn't know thought that I was demoted because I had to constantly travel to attend useless sales meetings and engineering calls. Now they'll be able to figure out that the real reason I lost all the interesting projects was because my boss wanted me out of the way so he could have sex with my damn wife. He got up. I'm sorry. I can't handle this anymore. I'm going home. Beth also stood up, trying to approach him. She looked worried. You take care of yourself, Paul, don't you? You feed yourself? He gave her a derogatory look. Yes, of course. Like you care about me. Beth sighed and choked on a sob. He turned to Sally, who was now standing slightly away from him. Sally, despite your role in this, I really feel sorry for you. You thought they were only doing this so she could be your sexual replacement, right? Sally nodded. Paul continued, But that's not really true, is it? They're having a hot and steamy love affair. They're not just sex buddies anymore. They're now lovers. Passionate, soulless lovers. He left the house and returned home. The next few days were a blur for Paul. He didn't see anyone, didn't talk to anyone. He turned off all the phones. He drank all the alcohol in the cupboard and was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of water in front of him when the doorbell rang. Automatically, but without much desire, he went to the door. He hoped they were Mormon missionaries or Jehovah's Witnesses, so he could tell them to leave. He hoped it wasn't Beth or anyone he knew. When he opened the door, he was shocked to see his secretary, Ronda, standing in the doorway. In fact, he wasn't sure if she was still his secretary. He didn't know if he still had a job, much less cared. Can I come in, Paul? She asked kindly. Yes, sorry, Ronda. Where are my manners? Sorry. Please come in. Ronda closed the door behind her and looked at Paul, barely holding back tears from what she saw. He was unkempt, neglected, and smelled like he desperately needed a shower. And he looked thinner. Paul led her into the living room of a house that she felt didn't feel like home anymore. Paul, when was the last time you ate a full meal? He looked puzzled. I don't remember exactly. Last time I ate. Oh, I had breakfast with Beth today. He shook his head, puzzled. No, it was the morning before my trip to the north. When was that? Oh, Paul! She was horrified. Your trip was last Thursday. You haven't eaten for 7 days. She noticed a discarded cookie wrapper on the table. And you just lived on cookies and snacks, didn't you? He looked at her and suddenly lost control. He did what he was ashamed to do in front of those who deceived him. He burst into tears. Ronda hugged him and let him cry. God, you need this, don't you, you poor, poor soul? What the hell did those bastards do to you? He sat down on the sofa. She sat next to him. She noticed that he had not shaved for a week, that his hair was unwashed and that he smelled sour. The skin of his face under his beard seemed saggy. He has aged a lot. He had difficulty telling Ronda everything that happened to him without leaving out a single detail. At the end of her story, Ronda raised her hands in horror. "Rotten, slippery scoundrels," she shouted. "How could they treat you like that? Someone they love or claim to love, only God knows. You're coming home with me. Pack some clothes and your own shaving accessories and toothbrush. You're staying with me." When they arrived at Ronda's house, Paul noticed how nice it was. It was a cozy, real home. Paul knew that she was widowed and that her son lived in the States. He was doing something in Silicon Valley and had been there for several years, and according to Ronda, everything was fine with him. After he showered and shaved, Paul got dressed in the clothes he brought with him from home. "Sit down, Paul," she said, smiling at him. "I'll make you eat. This is a dish that my grandmother Mary from Lancashire used to make for us when we were sick. It's called pobs. It's basically bread in hot milk, with cinnamon and a little sugar. This is what they give you when you don't feel well and don't eat." He took the spoon, tasted it, and said, "Oh, wow, this is delicious." He ate carefully, intuitively knowing that eating food quickly would make him sick. When he had finished, she said, "I think your best bet is to try to get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow I will cook you breakfast. You can spend the night in my guest room. I made the bed there while you took a shower. We can talk in the morning. But now it's time for me to help you find out something." "Oh," he said, intrigued. "Yes. The problem with cheaters is that they even cheat on each other. It is possible that Gary sleeps with multiple partners. Have you thought about this? The fact that your loving wife could bring home an STD? Oh, damn. No, I need to get checked out at an STD clinic," Paul exclaimed, clearly tormented by the thought. "Don't panic," Ronda said firmly. "We don't need this. I doubt you remember anything. But my sister Dottie works in a medical supply warehouse. I asked her to bring me a complete home STD testing kit. It tests everything, including HIV. This is an experimental apparatus. You no longer need to send a sample to a laboratory. He does everything for you overnight. He'll give us the results in the morning. I doubt you have anything, but it's better to be safe." He kissed her cheek and whispered, "Thank you, Ronda. Thank you very much." She used a stylus to take a blood sample from a puncture on his right arm, dipped a test strip into his blood, and placed it in the machine. That night, for the first time since he saw Gary having sex with Beth, he slept well and did not see this terrible scene in his mind over and over again. The next morning, after he shaved and showered again, he sat down at Ronda's breakfast and ate an omelet with toast. Another good, simple meal. He was glad that he was gradually getting back into the habit of eating. Ronda showed Paul the test results on a printout from her laptop connected to a home STD tester. "Thank God, I am clean. Oh, Ronda, it makes my soul so much better." She smiled at him and said, "Oh, I'm just glad I could help you." He looked at Ronda, and it seemed to him that he was seeing her for the first time. She was 10 years older than him and Beth, but he suddenly realized how beautiful she was. Then he noticed that she had large breasts, much larger than Beth's, and that Ronda had a deep and rather attractive cleavage. "What are you looking at, Paul?" she asked him, amused by his interested expression. He hesitated, wondering what he should do when caught off guard. He decided that honesty would be the best policy. I was looking at your breasts." Ronda laughed and blushed. "Oh. Truth? These old things?" She made them jump. "I've had them for a long time, and you're just now noticing them?" "Oh, no," Paul said sincerely. "I've always noticed them, but I never realized how cute they are, until now." The situation began to spin out of control like a train, which suddenly picked up speed. In Ronda's head it sounded, "Don't look at my breasts. You are a married man, and I am a widow." However, these words somehow came out wrong. Instead, from her lips came, "Oh, Paul, do you really love them? Do you want to see them closer?" He nodded, as if in a trance. Before the part of her that wanted to be reasonable could take over, she quickly pulled her cardigan over her head and Paul even screamed as her breasts shook and shook, freed from their restraints and her clothes. "Damn it!" he shouted. She burst out laughing. "Do you like it?" she said shyly. "Oh, God, yes," he admired. Within a minute, they were in Ronda's bedroom. Paul really liked it and told her about it. He noticed a photograph of a smiling young version of Ronda with a handsome young man in an RAF pilot's uniform. "Is this you and your husband?" he asked, as if in passing. "Yes, it's Pete and I. He was an RAF fighter pilot during the First Gulf War. Strangely, it wasn't his service that killed him. He somehow developed COPD and died in my arms in hospital. He was only 38 years old." Tears sparkled in her eyes. She hadn't talked to anyone about her Pete in a while, so talking about him with the man she was about to have sex with was kind of weird, to be honest. Paul sensed her inner turmoil. He looked at the photo and said softly, "He looks like a real good guy. You two must have been very happy together." Pain flashed across her face. She nodded, unable to speak. "Pete has nothing to worry about," Paul said, sincerity coloring his tone of voice. "I will treat you well, Ronda, and I will never let you down." Ronda nodded. She walked around to the other side of the bed, picked up the photo, kissed it, and whispered, "See you soon, Pete," and carefully placed it face down on the nightstand. She looked at Paul, smiled, and said in a hoarse whisper, "Make me your woman, please, and don't worry. I got my tubes tied after my son was born." Paul nodded, and Ronda and him quickly undressed and lay down next to each other on the bed. They kissed and hugged for what seemed like an eternity. Paul looked into her eyes. She smiled at him, hesitantly, and asked, "What are you thinking about, Paul?" He smiled back at her, saying, "About how much I want you, and I need you. A lot has happened to me in the last week. Finding you saved my life." "You didn't have to go far to find me, Paul. I was there every day, wanted you, craved you, but knew I could never have you. But that changed, and here we are, together." They made love again and immediately fell into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, things weren't going so well in Damson Glade. Beth wandered around, depressed, and Gary was able to go to the office a few times. Sally wasn't sure if it was machismo or if he was just too thick-skinned to care much. Sally decided things had gone too far. She knew full well that it might be too late to save Beth and Paul's marriage. But damn it, she was going to try. Oddly enough, at the same time that Paul and Ronda were making love, Sally was reaching out to two lovers. "I don't want you to have sex right now. From everything Paul told me, you two idiots are in love. Is that true?" They didn't say anything, but looked at each other guiltily. "Oh," said Sally. "Well, I guess that answers my question. So, what now? Gary, are you going to divorce me and marry Beth?" "No," said Gary. "I want you both to live here with me. I know it's not ideal for you, Sally, not to be able to make love, and I'll try not to rub it in your face when I have sex with Beth. Really, I mean it." He nodded for emphasis. "That's so noble of you. As long as you have Beth and me here as your wives and live like a 19th century Mormon prophet, where does that leave poor Paul?" Beth told her, "Sally, I honestly don't know. I still love Paul, but I'm not in love with him like a wife should be with her husband. I'm sorry about it, Sally, but I'm in love with Gary." Sally shook her head. "So the fact that we upset him so much that he tried to kill himself is really not important to you?" "Of course it's important to me." Beth screamed. "I'm not a monster. Please don't think I don't care about him, because I don't. It's just the kind of love you feel for a good friend, not a lover." Sally crossed her arms before speaking again. "We really ruined him, didn't we? So there's no hope for your marriage? If that's the case, we'd better arrange a meeting with him and try to figure out what we can do to at least make the end of his marriage as painless as possible for him. We owe him that, at a minimum." Gary sighed and said, "Of course I'll have to fire him. From his job, I mean." Sally looked at him and hissed, "No!" This made Gary jump at the venom in her one word. "But you don't understand, Sal. I'm going to have to fire him. He won't want to work there knowing that well, my wife and I are having an affair." Sally shook her head. That's not enough, Gary. If you do that, what happens when he decides to sue the company? Gary shrugged. God, Gary, Sally thought to herself. This novel of yours has turned you from a #1 businessman into a first-class idiot. She suppressed her anger and replied to Gary, You can't fire him. If you don't have the guts to work with him, just keep him on the books as a consultant. And to soften the sure blow to his self-esteem, give him a huge raise. And don't tell me that we can't afford this, because I know we can. He agreed to her proposal, and thus Paul was removed from the list and received a large increase in income as a consultant. Meanwhile, Sally began to feel resentful of the fact that she, the betrayed wife she finally realized she was, had to try to do everything herself. She often called, texted, or emailed Paul to see how he was doing, but Beth seemed uninterested in even texting him, let alone talking to him, even though he made several attempts to start a conversation with her first. And Sally was trying to hold her own marriage together, although she was beginning to wonder why she was even doing this, to be honest. Just over a month after the day Paul learned of his wife's infidelity, Sally asked to meet Paul, the meeting place being the Weatherspoons pub on the high street. She arrived a few minutes early and ordered a pint of old speckled hen, sitting at a table near the door. When Sally saw Paul arrive hugging Ronda, she nearly spat out her drink. She handled herself well enough and greeted Ronda with a hug and a kiss. While Paul went to get drinks, Sally asked Ronda, Are you together? Ronda smiled and shrugged. I guess you could say that. Oh, wow, all that Sally could say. Damn, I have to say, this is a little unexpected. So how did this happen? Ronda shook her head. I think it's better to let Paul tell you about it, if you don't mind. Of course I don't mind. It's just, I was trying to help Beth get her head out of her ass and pull herself together so she could get back to her husband, but it looks like a replacement has already been found to be Paul's wife. Ronda shrugged. Oh, I don't know about that. I was always drawn to Paul. I would never have gone for it, but given the circumstances, when the door of opportunity opened for me, I just walked in. I can't blame you, Sally replied. Oh, wait, here's Paul with the drinks. Sally looked at Paul. She smiled at him. Looks like congratulations are in order, Paul? Paul smiled back. Maybe you're right, Sally, but that's a question for the future. It would be nice if I could meet with Beth to talk things over, see if anything can be fixed, but, well, after a year of her affair with Gary and her reluctance to talk to me in any meaningful way, I'm not sure there's anything left to fix, to be honest. Sally reached out and stroked Paul's arm. I'm not surprised, really. I'm still so angry about how they treated you. If I were Beth, I'd sleep on your doorstep day and night until you forgave me. Ronda chimed in. Yeah, but you're not her, are you, Sally? Looking at it from a woman's point of view and from the outside, I think you've been deceived and misled. In what way, Ronda? Sally was intrigued by what Ronda was saying. Oh, just think about it. She's telling you that she agrees to be your replacement so Gary doesn't cheat on you, but she doesn't want her husband to know. I wouldn't be surprised if she used her idea of being your replacement as a cover for her real intentions, which was an affair with Gary. Crap, said Sally. I didn't think about this before, although I was a fool for not thinking about it, right? Paul spoke up. Sometimes we trust people we shouldn't trust, but because we love or respect them, we don't realize we shouldn't trust them. As soon as he said this, he saw a flash of pain on Sally's face. Well, Sal, I'm sorry if that remark hurts, but it hurt because it was too close to the truth for comfort, Sally said, her voice tinged with regret. You're right. Your wife and your two best friends. Hell, if you can't trust us, who can you trust? He shrugged, and Ronda gave him a comforting squeeze. They continued talking like the old friends they were. Eventually, after finishing their drinks, they prepared to leave the pub. You'll have to tell Beth, you know, Sally said. Or do you want me to tell her? Oh, I'd hate to use you as a go-between, but I really don't want to talk to Beth right now, Paul admitted. Why? Sally asked tenderly. Because now it makes me so nervous that I think I'm going to get sick. Sally nodded thoughtfully. I'll tell her, she said. The news that Paul was having sex with Ronda infuriated Beth. What impudence this woman has. She lost her temper. She's old and she has saggy breasts. This bitch should leave my husband alone, or I might decide to divorce him. Sally surprised herself. She really wanted to punch Beth in the face. Very much. Her attitude was very annoying. Don't be such a damn hypocrite, Beth. You've been entertaining my husband for the last year, and when Paul starts having fun too, you start squealing. Grow up, for God's sake. And if you and Gary ever want to start dating again, you will be kind to Paul. And please talk to Paul. You owe him that, don't you? Beth shrugged in response. Well, if you don't want to talk to him, I will, Sally said sharply. And that was what happened over the next few months. Sometimes Sally and Paul chatted on the phone, sometimes they exchanged text messages or emails, and often met to chat over food, usually in a Wetherspoons pub. Their last conversation made Sally think. Sally, Paul sounded uncertain, have you gotten a second opinion about your physical condition, which makes it impossible for you to make love? No, I didn't. The surgeon I went to was supposedly the best in Europe. I saw him at his clinic on Harley Street. For what it's worth, I'd go to my GP and ask for a referral to an NHS surgeon. After all, you've got nothing to lose. When Paul filed for divorce due to irreconcilable differences, it became the catalyst for Sally to also decide to leave and file for divorce. She was a wealthy woman in her own right, so she didn't have to wait for anything as part of the divorce agreement, and she bought a new townhouse in a gated community just off the main street. She had news for Paul, whom she had not spoken to for a long time. She sent him a message and arranged to meet him at the pub. When he arrived, she realized that he looked rather shabby. What's wrong, Paul? Where's Ronda? I hope she didn't think I excluded her from our meeting today? Paul shrugged. I don't know about Ronda. She and I are not together anymore. We're not a couple anymore. Oh, hell, no. Why? When did this happen? A month ago, Paul answered. It's all so stupid, really. She spent a couple of weeks in San Francisco. Her son works as a software engineer at Cisco, I think. And when she came back, she told me she was going to move in with him. I was a little taken aback by that. I asked her when we were moving and she burst into tears and said I wouldn't go with her. It hit me hard. When I asked her why, what did I do, she said it wasn't me, it was her. She told me that she promised her dying husband Pete that she would remain faithful to him, and that our relationship made her feel like she was cheating on him. And when I looked into her eyes, I could tell she wasn't lying. Sally winced inwardly, and after taking a deep sip of her pint, said, What happened? We didn't live together. We each had our own place, so all I had to do was pack up all my things and take them back to my house. We spoke on the phone a few days after she told me that she gave her sister a power of attorney, or whatever it's called today, to sell her house and belongings. I walked Ronda onto her flight 2 weeks ago. Neither of us could stop crying. She told me that she would always love me no matter what, but that she would dedicate her life to taking care of her grandchildren. I gave her a very modest kiss on the lips, and we parted forever. Oh, Christ, Paul. With Beth, you definitely didn't deserve for Ronda to do that to you, too. Paul looked into her eyes. Is it me? Is there something wrong with me? Sally shook her head and smiled. No, you're fine. Your self-esteem took a big hit, but it's not permanently damaged, I think. She paused, thinking, before continuing. Paul, I still feel like I owe you an apology. She stopped him from protesting. No, it's true. That's how I feel. When you were unconscious that first day while you were sleeping, I made you a promise that no matter what happened, I wouldn't let Beth, who was my replacement with Gary, ruin your marriage. Even though I meant every word of that promise, if I had been thinking straight, I would never have made it because I couldn't control what Beth and Gary did. I understand that now, but then I was absorbed in events. Paul smiled at her. I accept your apology. She answered him with a smile. But there is something else I need to tell you. I am also grateful to you. I followed your advice and got a referral to a surgeon at the local hospital. I had to wait a month to see him after my GP referred me, but it was worth it. He told me the Harley Street surgeon had made a lot of mistakes and given me terrible advice. It turned out the mistake could be corrected, and thus, I can now have sex again. Oh, that's great news. What do Gary and Beth think about it? Sally shrugged. I don't know and I don't care. I left him and Beth living in the house. I filed for divorce last week. So, have you had sex yet? Paul said in a low voice. Instinctively, Sally knew that he thought his marriage had been broken up for no reason. Not yet, Paul, she said in a hesitant voice. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today. Now that Rhonda's gone, it's easier. Paul, could you please have sex with me to help me check things out? Paul looked at her, amazed at this turn of events. Why me? I think I owe you for helping ruin your marriage. Besides, I've always wanted you. Look, let's go to my place. It's very close and we can open a bottle of wine and talk more about it. And that's what they did. After drinking 2 bottles of sparkling wine from the Kent vineyards, they ended up in Sally's bedroom. They stood naked, and one look at Sally's beautiful body, her eyes and shiny black hair, excited Paul. Be careful, please, Paul. This is the first time I've been with a man in almost 2 years. I'll be very careful, he promised. They enjoyed foreplay for a while, until Sally felt she was ready for the moment of truth. They made love twice more and decided to sleep until the morning. Was it sex, or a night spent in each other's arms that sealed their destiny together? It didn't matter because the result was the same. They decided that after receiving the final divorce decree, they would get married. They spent several weeks deciding the details of their wedding and honeymoon. They planned a special multicultural wedding that reflected their own roots. Paul could have worn a kilt, but decided against it. Instead, he wore a sweat and tie in his clan tartan. And when he saw Sally in her new wedding sari, he almost cried with joy. You are so beautiful! I feel like the happiest person in the world! And so the wedding of Paul Angus Augustine and Salvinder Sahota Kaur took place. There was a Universalist church minister for Paul and Sally's Sikh friend from college in colorful ceremonial robes for Sally, and they exchanged vows that they had written. The ceremony took place outdoors under a large canopy, and luckily the weather was kind to them. Women from a local Sikh Gurdwara provided catering, and Paul's friend, who owned a mobile bar, provided the bar for free. Paul only paid for the drinks. And a mutual friend was involved in photography and videography. Ronda came with her son, who looked at Paul coldly, which made Paul smile. And although Beth and Gary were invited, they didn't show up. They had sent a nice gift, however. So their absence didn't seem like such a big snub, although both Sally and Paul considered it a snub. Unfortunately, the damage caused by Sally's inept surgeon meant it was unlikely she would be able to have children, but IVF, adoption, or foster care were always options. Life, Paul realized, was pretty good. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.